He shows us his credentials. He was active duty C-130. And then he told us the following story, among many other things that he told us. He said back in 2005, he was deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq running missions as a C-130 cargo pilot. And oftentimes they would have him fly into Bagram Airfield. And these were routine missions. And so on one of these missions, he's flying into Bagram. But this time when he landed, he was met, as soon as he deplaned, he was met on the tarmac by some individuals that he describes as the babysitters. He calls them the babysitters. He thinks they were either Army intelligence or Air Force intelligence guys. They didn't tell him. But this was different because when he disembarked, they told him, no photos, no mention of this ever, this never happened. So he knew that whatever was about to happen was top secret. And he had flown classified missions before, usually retrieving Taliban guys, what he described as high-valued assets. But this was different because there were intelligence guys on the tarmac waiting for something. And it turns out what they were waiting for was the cargo that was being delivered on a forklift to the C-130. And the pilot says that the first thing that struck him as this cargo was moving toward him and his crew was the odor. He said it smelled like musk, BO, and death. And it was extremely pungent. And when the cargo arrived, it was on an air cargo pallet, which is 7 by 9. And he could see that there was a person on the pallet in the fetal position. And this individual was so large that his hands and his feet and part of his head were hanging off the pallet. And he and his loadmaster, and there were some Marines who accompanied the pallet, who accompanied this cargo, they were actually putting their feet up to this guy's feet, this dead giant's feet, and seeing how small their feet were compared to his. Now, the giant had red hair. He had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. His feet were wrapped in like a crude canvas foot wrapping. And he was solid as a rock. Again, most of his body was covered by a tarp, but the pilot and the guys around him were hitting him with their fists. And he came up to about their midsection, laying in the fetal position. And the pilot told me he was solid as a rock, this guy. And he asked the Marines, what happened? Where did this guy come from? And they told him that they had heard that there was a team that was out in Afghanistan that was looking for Taliban or something. And they came upon a cave because there was a nearby village, and the villagers were bringing food and other artifacts to the mouth of this cave. And so they thought that they're aiding and abetting the Taliban. So they went into the cave, and rather than encountering the Taliban, what they found was this enormous humanoid who killed them all. And then, according to these soldiers, they deployed another team to go look for that team. And when they found the cave, they found the traces of that other team. They were ready. They were prepared. And they were able to kill the giant. In fact, the soldiers told the pilot that the giant was eating on members of the team who had killed previously. But these new guys, they took him down, and then they had a transport helicopter come in and airlift him to Bagram.
Did you ever try to find records of who was there and casualties that were reported, deaths that were reported?
It's very difficult. The Pentagon actually released a statement some years ago, which is bizarre to me, basically saying, and paraphrasing, the Kandahar giant incident never happened. There was never a giant that was killed in Afghanistan.
The Pentagon?
So yeah, it was a representative. It was like a spokesman from the Pentagon or something, or a release from the Pentagon.
Is this available online?
Yeah. They actually felt the need to debunk this.
That's hilarious.
Now,
that gets me sketchy.
Well, I believed the pilot because he was a very credible guy. He didn't want his name out there. He didn't want fame or notoriety. He was very nervous. He thought there's a good chance that they're going to recognize me by my voice. He was on Coast to Coast AM, and then he's on in our documentary. There's a good chance I'm going to get recognized and there's going to be some reprisal. He was nervous. Now, they weighed the giant before they loaded him on the C-130, because they have to load everything that goes onto the C-130. The loadmaster weighed him. He weighed 1,100 pounds. And they estimated his height at 10 to 12 feet tall. And so they loaded him onto the C-130, and then they flew him to Qatar. And then they unloaded the cargo in Qatar. And our pilot told me he heard through the grapevine that the body ended up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He said, I don't know. That's just what I heard. So this is a firsthand account from the C-130 pilot who flew the body himself from Bagram Airfield to Qatar.
Why does all the weird shit go to Wright-Patterson?
That's a good question.
Because that's where the weird shit goes.
Wright-Patterson used to have the Blue Room. I don't know if they still have it, but they used to have a room there called the Blue Room where they had all of the alien artifacts that had been recovered and that they were studying. And it was completely off limits to anybody except for people who had access, the very few who had access. And but the Kandahar Giant, that story, a colleague of mine, L.A. Marsuli, he had another guy come to him, a different guy. We interviewed the pilot, Steve and I. L.A. had another guy come to him that was, I can't remember the details, he was a special forces guy. He had firsthand knowledge of the event as well. And we're not sure if it's the same one or a different one. If there was just one incident with the Giants or if there were multiple incidents. Now, years later, this would be just a couple of years ago because we published that film, I think, back in 2016. But just a couple of years ago, and I do have to be very careful here, I ran into a gentleman who was very high up, let's say, in the operations happening out there during the Iraq War and in Afghanistan. And this individual had he'd flown a lot of missions, and he was a commander. And I asked him, we were having a casual conversation, and he starts to walk away, and I said, hey, you were in flying missions in Afghanistan. I said, have you ever heard about the Kandahar Giant? And his wife was standing next to me, and he's sort of walking away. He turns around. The blood rushes out of his face, and he literally goes like this to me, points to his phone, and his wife whispers, he can't talk about that. So later on, I was able to, we agreed to meet it later on and in a very controlled environment. And he related a story to me that's the most wild story I've ever heard in my life. And I'm sorry, I can't relay it. I love this guy. I want to protect him. But it's not the giant of Kandahar. It's the giants of Kandahar. There's more than one. The military has known about it. And aside from him, I talked to other soldiers who've also had knowledge of the specific incident that I cited earlier, but then also in general the giants in Afghanistan. And I have a friend of mine who I met some years ago. Actually, I was with Lou Elizondo at Lou's Bar in Wyoming, and there was a friend of Lou's who's now a friend of mine there, and we were talking about the Kandahar Giant. I was just telling him the story I told you, and he just couldn't believe it. He thought, this is nuts. This is crazy. And I said, okay, do something for me. Next time you're talking to somebody in government or in the military who you think maybe might know something about this, bring it up. See what happens. So he called me one day and he said, Tim, you're not going to believe it. He said, I was talking to, I have to be very careful here too. He said, I was talking to a certain individual who works for a senator. He's a staffer. I believe he's a chief of staff for the senator, or at the very least an advisor. And he's got a military background, special forces. And he said, I was sitting there, we're really good friends. He said, we're having a casual conversation, as we always do. And just in the midst of this conversation, I said, hey, what do you know about the Kandahar Giant? And he said his face completely contorted. And they were no longer just being happy and laughing. He became very stern. And he said, what have you gotten yourself into?